In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural Martian surface material in Blender. If you'd like to help support this channel, you can purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store, and you also get access to the procedural material if you join my Patreon page. The links are in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials. And after this tutorial, if you'd like to learn how to create more procedural materials, then I have a tutorial playlist here on YouTube on how to create all of my procedural materials. And if you like creating Martian and sci-fi themed artwork in Blender, then you might be interested in checking out my Martian Environment Blender course. So it's a 7-part tutorial series where I show you step by step in real time how to create this Martian environment artwork. And you also might be interested in checking out another tutorial course I have on my Gumroad store on how to create this sci-fi space station corridor in Blender. And that is a 5-part video tutorial series where I show you step by step in real time how to create this space station corridor in Blender. So links are in the description if you'd like to check out those courses, and purchasing the courses is a great way to help support me and this channel. So before we create the procedural material, I wanted to show you what I have set up in the 3D space in case you want to set it up the same way that I have. So what I did is I pressed Shift A and I went here to Mesh and I added an icosphere, and then right behind me, if you open up the Add Icosphere settings right here, you can turn up the subdivisions so that it is very smooth. And then I also just shaded the object smooth with the object context menu, so I have a nice smooth icosphere to preview the material on. But you could also add this material onto a bumpy Martian surface. And then I also added a camera, and I pointed the camera at the icosphere. Now for the lighting, I added in this area light right here, and I pointed the area light down on the object. And then if you click right over here to the object data properties of the light, I set the color to kind of a yellowish orangey color to make it look more like Mars. And then also on the power here, I set this to 800, so it's pretty bright. And then to make the area light circular, I set the shape here to the disk. And then I also wanted to add another light as a rim light, so I added another area light, and this area light is kind of behind the sphere, pointed up at it. And then for the power, I set this to 1500, and for the color, I also set this to a white color, but it's very slightly yellow, and this will make the lighting look more like it's on Mars. And then I also set the shape to rectangle, and I turned up the X size, and that way it is nice and long, and so it'll work really well for a rim light. So that's going to give a little light right down there, and then of course there's the main light shining down on the object. And then to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, over here on the world, I added in this GeoGap HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Links in the description if you'd like to download it. So I downloaded the 1K HDR version of this HDRI. And then once you download the HDRI, you can go here to the world properties, and you can click on the little yellow dot there next to the color, and you can add the environment texture, and then you can click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And then I found that the strength of 1 was a little bit too bright, so I set the strength value to just like a 0.5 on the world settings, and that way the world is not quite as bright. And then if you want to make the background transparent, you can also click right here on the render properties, and you can open up the film tab, and you can just check mark the transparent button, and that way the background is transparent. And then to make the colors look a bit nicer, if you open up the color management settings, I set the view transform to filmic, and then I set the look to high contrast. And this is going to make the lighting a bit more contrasty, and it will also make the colors a bit more saturated and make the final render look nicer. Now I am also going to be using the displacements in the node editor to make the rocks actually pop out of the mesh. So if you want to use the displacements, you'll need to click right here on the render properties, and then you're going to need to change the render engine to cycles, because the node editor displacements will not work in Eevee, so make sure you are using cycles. And then I'm going to also be using the adaptive subdivision with the displacements. So if you want to use the adaptive subdivision, right here on the feature set, just set this to experimental. Now to make the adaptive displacement actually work, you need to go right here to the modifier properties, and you need to click on add modifier, and you need to add the subdivision surface modifier. And then if you turned on the experimental mode, there's going to be this adaptive subdivision, and you can just check mark that on the subdivision surface modifier. And this way it's going to add more detail where the camera can see it better and where it's closer up, but then where it's farther away, there's going to be less detail. And then this object is already a little bit subdivided, so on the dicing scale right here, I set this to a value of 3. So I am in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D view right here, and I'm in the rendered view, and then I have the shader nodes right here. So let's just click on new to add a new material. Now there is one more displacement setting that we need to turn on. Now that we've added a new material on this object, we need to go right down here to the material properties, and we need to open up this settings tab right here. And under the settings tab, we need to open up the surface, and then right here you can see there is a displacement setting. Now to get the displacements to actually work, we need to click on the bump only, and we need to click on displacement and bump. And this is going to tell this material that it can use the displacements. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview different nodes. So if you don't have that enabled, you can just click on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab, you can search for the Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So for this Martian surface material, I want to have 3 layers of rocks. I want to have some large rocks, some medium rocks, and some small rocks. So let's first start with the large rocks. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture, and let's just stick the Voronoi texture right here kind of in the center. And then I'm going to select the Voronoi texture, and I'm going to press Ctrl T, that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. Now I don't actually need the mapping, so I'm going to press X to delete it. And then I want to use the object coordinates on the texture coordinate, so let's pull out a wire from the object, and we're going to put that into the vector. And so by using the object coordinates, it's going to place the Voronoi texture on the objects more evenly. And then to preview the Voronoi texture on the object, I'm going to hold down the Control and Shift key and then select the Voronoi texture. And that is going to add this viewer node, and that is using the feature from the Node Wrangler add-on, and it's going to preview the Voronoi texture on the object, so we can actually see what the Voronoi is looking like. Now on the scale here of the Voronoi, I'm just going to change this to like a 3. So wherever these little circles are, those are where the rocks are going to be. Now right now those don't really look like rocks, they're very smooth and round and circular, so I want to distort the placement of the Voronoi to make it more bumpy and make it look more like rock. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. So let's click on the noise texture, and I'm going to drop the noise texture right here, kind of in front of the texture coordinate. So we are going to use the noise texture to distort the placement of the Voronoi to make it look more like rock and make it more random and organic and natural. So let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then I want to use the object coordinates as well on the noise texture. So let's pull out a wire from the object, and I'm going to stick that into the noise texture vector. Now on the noise texture, I'm going to turn the scale to like a 10 so that I can see more of the noise texture. And then I also want it to be very detailed. So let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15. And then I do want a little bit less roughness. So on the roughness value, I'm going to turn this to a 0.45, just so that there's a little bit less roughness. So now what I want to do is I want to take the color from the noise texture, and I want to put that into the vector of the Voronoi. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. So now you can see that the noise texture is distorting the placement of the Voronoi. And so it looks all random and it has lots of noise. Now the noise texture has distorted it way too much, so I can't actually see each individual rock. So I want the strength of the noise texture to be less strong. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the Mix RGB, and I'm going to drop the Mix RGB in between the 2 procedural textures. And then I'm going to take the original object coordinates, and I'm going to put that into color 1, and then the noise texture color is going to go into color 2. So what this Mix RGB is doing is it's blending between the object coordinates and the noise texture. So if I drag the factor all the way up to 1, it is going to use all the noise texture, so you can see the Voronoi is very distorted, but if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's not distorted at all. Now you can see when I drag the factor around, it's moving the texture around a lot, and I don't really want it to do that. So on the mix here, I'm just going to click on this, and I'm going to change this to the linear light. So this way I can drag the factor, and you can see the texture isn't being moved around quite as much. So you can see there's the rocks, and each one of those dark areas is a rock, but then as I drag the factor up, it's going to distort the rocks more and more. Now I don't want them to be very distorted, I just want them to be a little bit distorted. So right here on the factor, I'm going to change this to a 0.15. So just a 0.15, and now you can definitely see that those rocks are still there, so there's those dark patches, but they are distorted and random. So I want to organize my nodes very well, and this way the procedural material will be much easier to understand. So what I'm going to do is select the texture coordinate, hold down the shift key, and select the noise texture. So with both of those nodes selected, I'm going to press Ctrl J. So Ctrl J is going to add a frame, and now I can move the frame around, and it's going to move the nodes around. And then I can click on the frame, and I can press F2, and that is going to add a label to the frame, and I'm going to rename this to mapping, because this is going to be the mapping of the different textures. And then these two nodes right here are going to create the large rocks. So I'm going to select the Mix RGB, hold down the shift key and select the Voronoi, and then I can press Ctrl J. That's going to add a frame, and it's going to put them both in the frame. And then if I select the frame, I can press F2, and that's going to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to large rocks. Now these rocks are not very contrasty, and I want to make them more contrasty to really make it very clear where they are. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp node, and we're going to stick the color ramp node right in here in this wire, and then I'm going to drag it into the large rocks frame, and I'm just going to bring it out here. And then just make sure you Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So to make this more contrasty, I'm first going to click on this arrow here, and I'm going to click on the flip color ramp. That's going to flip these two colors, and so now you can see that those look a bit more like rocks. And then I'm going to click on the black tab, and I'm going to start to drag this out, and as I drag the black tab closer and closer, everything is becoming more black, but just the rocks are showing. So you can now see what the rocks are looking like. And so you can use this to change the size of the rocks. So I want to drag the black tab to about here, so the rocks are pretty big, and there's just some different rocks here and there. And then I do want to make the rocks more contrasty, so let's click on the white tab, and I'm going to drag the white tab over a bit so that they're a bit more white. Alright, so that is the texture for the large rocks. So I want to make some medium rocks and some small rocks. So I'm going to click on the frame, and I'm going to drag it down a bit, just kind of drag it down here, and then I'm going to press the B for the box select, and I'm going to box select all of these nodes here and the frame. I can now press Ctrl Shift D. So normally if you press Shift D, that is just going to duplicate the nodes, but if you instead press Ctrl Shift D, that is going to duplicate the nodes, but it's going to keep the wires plugged up, because I still want to use these mapping nodes here. So I'm going to drag this up here, and then if you click on the frame, you can press F2 to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to medium rocks. And then to preview this, I'm going to Control Shift and select the color ramp here to preview it. Now right now it looks the same, so I want to change the scale here to make the rocks smaller. So I'm going to change the scale here on the Voronoi texture to like a 15, and now those rocks are much smaller. Now you can see they're very distorted, and so they don't really look like rocks anymore. So right here on the linear light, I want to turn the factor down. So I'm going to turn the factor down to a 0.05, just a 0.05, and now the distortion is less, and so they look more like rocks. And then I don't want them to be quite as contrasty, so right here on the color ramp, let's just drag this back a little bit so they're not quite as bright. Alright, so now we have the large rocks and the medium rocks. So I want to make one more group of rocks, and that is going to be small rocks. So press the A key to deselect everything, press B for the box select. Let's just box select all of these nodes here, so select all the medium rocks, and then I'm going to press Control Shift D, and I'm going to bring this up here. So I can now Control Shift and select this color ramp to preview it, and then I want to click on the medium rocks frame, and I can press F2 to rename it, and instead of it being medium rocks, I'm going to rename it to small rocks. And then to make these rocks smaller, I can click on the scale here, and I'm going to change this to like a 30. So now those rocks are even smaller. Now I also want to add one more texture, and that is going to be just a noise texture, which is going to cover the entire surface and make the ground kind of bumpy. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's click on the noise texture, and I'm going to drop it right here underneath the large rocks. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then I also want to use the object coordinates, so let's pull out a wire from the object here on the texture coordinate, and I'm going to drag my mouse down, and I'm going to stick this into the vector of the noise texture. Now you can see that this wire here is kind of overlapping some of the nodes, so to fix this, I can just hold down the Shift key, and then I can right click and drag, and I'm going to drag a line over this wire and then let go. And and that is going to add this reroute, and I can just drag the reroute over and stick it here. And this is totally optional, but if you want to make your node setup look a bit more clean and neat, then you can do that. So I'm just going to drag this over here. Now I want to add this into a frame as well, so I'm going to press B for the box select, and I'm going to box select the reroute and the noise texture, and then I'm going to press Ctrl J. That is going to add a frame. I could bring this over, and then also I could bring the reroute down a bit. And then I'm going to click on this frame here, and then I can press F2 to rename the frame, and I'm going to rename this frame to ground noise. So now let's change some of the settings of the noise texture. So I'm going to turn the scale value to like 8, and then I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15. And then I want to add a little bit more roughness, so let's change the roughness to a 0.55. So now I want to mix all of these textures together. So let's first start with the large rocks and the ground noise. So I'm going to select the noise texture, hold down the shift key, and select this color ramp right here. I'm now going to press Control 0. So by pressing Control 0, that is going to add this Mix RGB node, and I'm going to bring this over and then click on the arrow to open it up. And the Mix RGB node can mix two colors together. So we have color 1 and color 2. Now I actually want to flip these, so let's take the noise texture factor, and I'm going to put the wire into color 1, and then the large rocks color ramp is going to be going into color 2. And then just make sure you Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Now I just want to add the dark values. So if I click on the mix here, I can just change this to darken. So this way it's just going to add the dark values. So if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just going to use the noise texture. But then as I turn the factor up, it's going to add more and more the dark values from this color ramp. So if I turn the factor all the way to 1, it's going to add all of the dark values, and so now it's going to be very dark. But I don't want it to be super dark because now it just appears as though it's only using this color ramp. So on the factor here, I'm going to change this to a 0.55. And this way it's only using some of the dark values from the color ramp, but not all of them. And so this way you can clearly see the large rocks, but then around the large rocks there is this darker area, and this is where the sand or the dirt is going to be. So now let's go up here, and I want to mix the small rocks and the medium rocks together. So to do this, you can select the color ramp, hold down the shift key and select the other color ramp, and then I can press Control 0 again, and that is going to add this Mix RGB. So let's just drag this over, and then I can click on the arrow to open it up. And then to preview what it's actually looking like, I can Control Shift and select the Mix RGB to preview it. Now again, if you just set this to mix, which is the default, it's just going to blend between color 1 and color 2. But instead of just blending between them, I want to add both the small rocks and the medium rocks together. So I'm going to click on the mix right here, and I'm going to change this to lighten because we just want to add the light values because the rocks are a lighter color. So if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just using the small rocks, but then as I turn the factor up, it's using more and more of the white values from the medium rocks. So I can turn the factor all the way to 1, and now it's mixing the small rocks and the medium rocks together. So I'm going to press A to deselect everything. Let's just press B for the box select, and I'm just going to box select these nodes here and kind of bring them over so we have a bit more space. So I now have this darken and this lighten, and I want to join them together. So I'm just going to select the lighten, hold down the shift key and select the darken, and then again I can press Control 0, and that is going to add another Mix RGB. So we are now mixing both of these Mix RGBs together with another Mix RGB. And then again I want to flip these wires because I want the small rocks and the medium rocks to be going into color 2. So let's take the lighten and we are going to put that into color 2, and then the darken is going to go into color 1. Now again, I just want to add the light values so that we can just add the medium rocks and the small rocks. So let's click on the mix right here, and I'm going to change this to lighten. So if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just using the darken, so it's just using the large rocks and the ground noise, but then as I turn the factor up, it's going to use more and more of the other rocks. Now these rocks are going to be smaller and they're going to be more subtle, so I don't want to turn the factor all the way up to 1. So I'm just going to turn the factor to a 0.3, and that way you can still see the small rocks and the medium rocks, but they are more subtle and you're not able to see them quite as well. Alright, so now this final Mix RGB has mixed all of the different textures together. So now what I want to do is I want to put this texture into the displacement to actually have it pop out the mesh. So let's take the color and I'm going to plug the color into the displacement here of the material output. And then I'm going to Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview this. And then also this is a white color right now. So just for now on the base color, I can just make this like a dark gray color and I can make it kind of like a brown color just so that it looks a little bit more like a rock color. So you can see something is wrong with the displacement. It's like really jagged and it's popping off to one side. And that is because this is color data, but this is displacement data. So we need a node in here to convert the color data into displacement data. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search and I'm going to search for the displacement node. So let's click on this displacement node and I'm going to stick it here in the wire. And then I'm just going to drag it right down here and stick it underneath the principled shader. Now you can see it's still not working. Now there isn't any displacement and it's kind of just pushing it over to the side. And that is because we actually need to take the color here from the lighten and we need to put it into the height value of the displacement. So this way it's going to actually convert it to displacement data. And why it's really spiky is because it's way too strong. So right here on the scale, I'm going to turn the scale way down and this is going to make the displacement less strong. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 0.14, just a 0.14, and that way it's going to be much more subtle. So now if you zoom into the material, you can see there's those big rocks, and then there's also the medium rocks and the small rocks, and they are popping out of the mesh. And then also in between the rocks, you can see there's some more noise there, and that is the sand and the dirt around the rock. Now, if you look up closely, you can see the rocks are very, very jagged and bumpy, and that doesn't look very realistic. So I want to make these rocks less bumpy and less jagged. So to do this, I can actually change the light values of all of these color ramps. Because what this displacement node does is it has the black values push back into the mesh, and then it has the light values push out of the mesh. If I Control Shift and select this lighten node, you can see that where the light parts are, it is popping out the mesh. So let me just Control Shift and select back on this principled shader. So what I can do is I can take the light values here on the color ramp and I can turn that down, and then the rocks are going to be less bumpy and less sharp. So I want the small rocks to be the smallest because they are the small rocks. So I'm going to click on the white here on this color ramp and I'm going to make this a darker color. And you can see as I turn this light value down, those small rocks are getting smaller and smaller, so they're not quite as strong. And if you'd like to use the exact color that I'm using for these small rocks, then you can go over here to the hex value and you can punch in a hex value of AC, AC, AC. So now that this is more of a gray color, you can see that those small rocks are very subtle and they're not popping out quite as much. So you can see the medium rocks are pretty jagged and bumpy as well, and so I want these rocks to be a bit less jagged. So let's click on the color ramp here, click on this white tab, and I can click on the white color, and on this white color I can make this a little bit more gray, and again you can see as I turn this down, the medium rocks are getting smaller and smaller. And if you'd like to use the same exact color that I'm using on the medium rocks here on the white tab, you can punch in a hex value of C7, C7, C7. So now you can see in the preview that the medium rocks are a bit less jagged and they look more realistic. And then let's go right down here to the large rocks. So here is one of the large rocks, and I do want these rocks to be pretty big, so I'm not going to make this color very dark, but I am going to click on the color here on the large rocks, and I'm just going to make this a little bit darker. And the hex value that I'll be using is going to be E0, E0, E0. So we are now getting a really cool Martian surface with lots of variation of rocks. So let's now just finish off this material. So I want to take the color here from this lighten, and I want to pull out a wire and I want to stick that into the normal just to give the material a little bit more bump. Now we need to convert this to normal data because this is color data, but then this is normal data. So to convert this to normal data, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a bump node, and let's drop the bump node right here between the lighten and the normal. And then I can also drag the displacement over. Now you can see the shading still looks a bit weird, and that is because we need to take the color from the lighten and we need to stick that into the height value of the bump. And this way it's going to actually convert it to normal data, and you can now see everything looks very bumpy. Now that is way too strong, so on the strength value right here on the bump, I'm just going to turn this down to like a 0.1 so it's much less bumpy. And then also you can see this wire here going into the displacement is overlapping the bump, so if you want to, you can hold down the Shift key, you can right click and drag and just add a reroute right there and then just drag this over so it's not overlapping. So right now this entire material is using just one single color, but instead of it using a single color, I want it to use a texture, and I want the rocks to be a different color from the sand. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull out a wire here from the light tin, and let's stick this into the base color. Now right now this is just black and white, but I want to have more control over the colors to actually make different colors for the rocks. So to do this, let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and I'm going to stick this right here between the light tin and the principled shader. And then I can Control Shift and select this color ramp here to preview it. So we can now change the colors of the color ramp, and that's going to change the colors of the rock and the ground. So I'm first going to click on this black tab, and I'm going to drag it over a little bit so that the ground is a bit darker. And then I'm going to click on the black tab, and I'm going to make this a little bit brighter, and then I'm going to make it a brown color. So it's going to be a very dark brown. And if you'd like to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 332814. So that is the dark brown color that I'm going to be using for the sand or the dirt. But you can see the material is still very light. So I'm going to click on this white tab, and I'm going to drag this white tab way over, and I'm going to bring it over to about here. And then this color is going to be a second ground color. So I'm going to click on the color here, and let's make this darker. And then I'm going to also make this a brown color. But this is going to be a bit more saturated and a little bit lighter. And if you'd like to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 4D, 2D, 1F. So now we have two different colors for the dirt. So I now want to make another tab, and I want this tab to be the color of the rocks. So I'm going to hold down the Control key and just click right here on the color, and that's going to add another tab. And then I'm going to drag this tab over, and then just to see this better, I'm going to click here on the color, and I'm going to make this a bit lighter. And I'm just scrolling my mouse wheel to make this color a bit lighter. So now you can see that this lighter color is controlling the color of the rocks. Now you can see the edge of the rocks is kind of blending in with the ground. So to make that more contrasty, I'm going to drag this lighter tab over, and I'm going to drag it closer to this tab. And then because these are Martian rocks, I want them to be very orange colored. So I'm going to make this kind of a darker color and then make it kind of reddish and orangish. And if you'd like to use the same exact color that I'm using, I'm going to be using a hex value of 5D 320D. So that is the color that I'll be using for the Martian rocks. Now you can see the Martian rocks are all one color, and that is because all of the color right here in the color ramp is just that single color. But I want to add one more color to add a little bit of variation to the rocks. So holding down the Control key, I'm going to click right here in the color. That's going to add another tab, and I'm going to drag this tab over to about here. And then to make this color just a little bit different, I'm going to click right here on the color, and I'm going to make this a little bit brighter. And so for this lighter rock color, I'm going to be using a hex value of 6D 402A. So you can see those rocks now have a little bit more variation, and you can see more noise in them. Alright, so that is it for the color. So I'm going to Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview the final material. So now you can see where those rocks are, it is more orange. Now there is one more thing that I want to do to this material, and that is to make the material more rough. Because you can see there is this roughness value right here on the principled shader, and so to make this look more like a Martian surface, I want this to look pretty dry and pretty rough. So let's take the color here from the light tin, and I'm going to stick this into the roughness value. Now when I add that in, you can see it looks very shiny, and that's not very realistic. So to make this more rough, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for another color ramp, and I'm going to stick the color ramp right in here between the light tin and the roughness. So I can now change these colors, and that is going to change how rough and shiny the material is. So I'm first going to click on the drop down arrow, and I'm going to click on the flip color ramp, and that is going to flip these two colors, so now it looks very rough. Now this is way too rough. If I zoom in here, it almost looks kind of chalky, and so I don't want it to be quite that rough. So I'm going to click on this white tab right here. I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to make this darker. And as I make this darker and darker, you can see it's going to be more shiny. So I do want this to be pretty rough, so I'm just going to make it a light gray. And the exact color that I'll be using on this white tab here is going to be a hex value of E7, E7, E7. And then I don't want this black tab right here to be fully black, because it is making those larger rocks a little bit bit shiny. So to make that more rough, I'm going to click here on the color, and I'm going to make this quite a bit brighter. And the hex value that I'll be using for this gray color is going to be a hex value of 5E, 5E, 5E. So now the Martian rock is pretty rough, but there is a little bit of variation in the roughness. And that is the material, so that is the procedural Martian surface. So I'll just give this a final render. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. And this procedural material is available for purchase on my Gumroad store, and you also get access to this procedural material if you join my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And my Gumroad store, Patreon page, and the YouTube memberships are all great ways to help support me and this channel. And if you'd like to purchase more of my procedural materials, you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. All the links are in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching.